Welcome to Scholarly and Storytelling. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most misunderstood eras. In this explainer, we are going to tear down the myths and uncover the truly surprising truths about the Middle Ages. So are you ready to have your view of the past completely flipped upside down? Let's get into it.
No, really, just think about it for a second. What's the very first image that flashes in your mind? I bet for a lot of us, it's something kind of like this.
1,000 years of just nothing. Intellectual darkness, right? A time when science and art and progress just ground to a halt. The Dark Ages, as they call them. Or maybe you're picturing something else, like muddy streets, people covered in grime, rampant plagues, and a world where nobody had even heard of a bar of soap.
Yeah, a primitive, brutal world. That's the story we're all told. But what if I told you that story isn't just a little off, but completely wrong? What if the reality was way more complex, and believe it or not, a whole lot cleaner?
All right, let's kick things off with one of the biggest myths of all, the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was just, well, disgustingly dirty. You're probably picturing folks who maybe bathed once a year, if they were lucky, right? Well, about that.
That whole idea of the unwashed medieval peasant, it's largely a myth. You see, tons of towns still had public bathhouses, a holdover from the Roman Empire. And get this, the church, which often gets blamed for suppressing all things fun and clean, actually built new bathhouses with separate spots for men and women. So while a private bath at home was a luxury, popping down to the public baths was pretty common.
And it wasn't just about bathing. Public sanitation was a real thing. Medieval London, for example, had over a dozen public toilets. And one of the most famous ones was built right into the structure of London Bridge. Just let that sink in for a second. Not exactly the primitive, unsanitary world we've been led to imagine.
So what about those gnarly, rotten medieval teeth we always see in the movies? Well, here's another shocker for you. For the average person, their teeth were in surprisingly good condition. And you want to know their secret? Their diet had almost no sugar. The real problem they had wasn't cavities, it was their teeth getting worn down from all the grit in their bread.
And they didn't just stumble into good dental health by accident. Oh no, they had a whole routine. People would rub their teeth and gums with linen cloths using special pastes made from things like ground sage and salt. And for fresh breath, they'd chew on cloves and cinnamon. Pretty sophisticated, huh?
Okay, so we've cleaned up the myths about hygiene. Now let's talk about what people were actually wearing. And it was far from the boring drab rags you might be thinking of. Medieval fashion was unique. It was creative, and sometimes it was just plain weird.
I mean, check these things out. They were called Krakow shoes, and they were a huge fashion statement for both men and women. The toes could get so ridiculously long that people had to stuff them with moss just to keep their shape. Were they practical? Absolutely not. But were they fashionable? You bet they were.
And are you ready for a real mind-blower? The bra was invented in the Middle Ages. It's true. Archaeologists have found examples that look incredibly modern. Now, most women just wore a simple linen shift under their dresses, but these more supportive garments did exist, even if they were considered a little bit scandalous at the time.
All right, so we've got hygiene, we've got fashion. Now let's get into the truly bizarre stuff. This is where medieval life stops sounding like history and starts to sound like it's straight out of a fantasy novel.
So in some parts of Europe, you know what the most common form of currency was? It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It was eels. Yeah, you heard me right, eels. At one point, records show that people in England owed a jaw-dropping 500,000 eels in rent and taxes every year. Can you imagine paying your landlord with a bucket of slippery fish?
Okay, this next one might be the strangest fact of all. In the Middle Ages, animals could be put on trial. I'm not kidding. They could get lawyers, stand before a jury, and receive a formal sentence. This quote right here, it's from an actual court verdict against a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, which was found guilty of the unnatural crime of laying an egg.
And that rooster wasn't some weird one-off event. This was a real, established legal practice. You had pigs being tried for attacking people, bugs being tried for destroying crops. There was even a court case involving a dolphin in Marseille. It's a completely different way of looking at the world, isn't it?
So when you start to piece all of this together, the bathing, the pointy shoes, the eel money, the animal trials, a much richer, much stranger picture of daily life starts to come into focus. It was a world that was in some ways familiar, but in other ways deeply, deeply weird.
Even the landscape itself would have looked different. I mean, take the animals. A full-grown bull back then, it was often only a little bigger than a calf is today. And that's because animals weren't scientifically bred for size. They mostly had to fend for themselves and find their own food, which stunted their growth. And how about those creepy-looking gargoyles you see on Gothic cathedrals? Turns out they weren't just there to look scary. They had an absolutely crucial, practical purpose. They were basically fancy waterspouts, designed to channel rainwater away from the stone walls to prevent erosion. It's a perfect blend of amazing art and clever engineering.
And of course, people needed to blow off some steam, right? Well, one of the most popular games back then was an early and frankly super chaotic version of football. It was a massive pastime, with whole villages playing against each other. But it got so violent and disruptive that in 1314, King Edward II actually had to ban it from being played in London.
Okay, so after looking at all of this evidence, from their bathing habits to their animal court cases, what's the big takeaway here? What does all this actually mean?
Well, the big idea is this. The Middle Ages were not the Dark Ages. That whole label was kind of pushed by later thinkers during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment to make their own time seem way more advanced. The reality is that this was a period filled with complexity, bizarre customs, and a ton of surprising innovation. It was a time that was messy, fascinating, and above all, deeply human.
And that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we got an entire 1,000-year period so wrong for so long, what other truths that you learned in history class are really just simple stories, hiding a much stranger and more interesting reality?
If you enjoyed digging into the past with us, make sure to subscribe to Scholarly and Storytelling for more surprising truths that bring history to life. Thanks so much for watching.